Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair. After last week's travesty, that was Batman v Superman, and since it's Thanksgiving this week, I wanted to relax a bit and watch some good sequels. And that got me thinking, and when I get thinking, what usually results is a video about whatever topic is on my mind. So we're just going to talk about some of my favorite sequels today. In fact, my top 15 favorite sequels. You know how when there's a movie you like, and sometimes the sequels are bad, but on rare occasions, the sequels manage to be either of equal caliber, or even better than the original? They're not just good movies, they're good sequels, and enhance your enjoyment of the first one merely by existing. That's the benchmark by which I define my favorite sequels. Now, before we start, I am going to have some ground rules for this. More stringent ground rules than I have ever had for a list before. Number one sequel per franchise. If we don't, this list would be entirely filled up with one or two long-running franchises. And yeah, obviously those are rife with good sequels, so they're going to be on the list somewhere. Number two, I am going to try my hardest to not have anything on the list that I've already reviewed. So while I do love Ghostbusters 2 as a sequel, I've already dedicated an entire video to that, so putting it here would just be overkill. Which by extension means I'm also going to try to keep anything out that I plan on making a full video on in the future. Though by the nature of this list being about good sequels, that shouldn't be that hard. Other than that, anything's fair game. And to be clear, I define a sequel as any subsequent entry in a franchise after the original, and not just the initial second entry. So if they were on the list, and they're not, sorry, I would count every Harry Potter or Alien movie after the first ones equally as sequels. Anyway, before we begin, I just want to make it clear, this list is entirely subjective and based on my own opinions, and sequels that I have actually seen. I have pretty eclectic tastes, so I'm probably going to omit your favorites, but sorry, I can only talk about movies that I've seen. Alright, let's get straight to the video. This is my top 15 favorite sequels. Number 15, The Santa Claus 2. Starting off with this, mainly because it's Christmas related, and this December is gonna be a little different, so I want to get in some traditional Yuletide stuff now. Yeah, I know that it's the week of Thanksgiving, but bear with me. The Santa Claus is a great movie. It is a Christmas classic, but the sequel is even better. Between the really interesting character stuff between Scott and Charlie and Scott and Carol, and the utterly insane stuff with Tim Allen hamming it up as Toy Santa, it manages to surpass the original in every way. The first movie was about a workaholic father learning to have time for his son and reconnect with him. The second movie is about the workaholic father finding love again while doing the same thing, but now it's higher stakes. He reconnected with his son, but his son is becoming a delinquent because being Santa made him even more of a workaholic. Plus, the addition of the Council of Legendary Figures, giving this world's holidays a much more expansive mythology, makes this a great sequel. And again, Toy Santa.
This Christmas, we're going to give those greedy, selfish little kids exactly what they deserve.
Really, this movie takes the story of the original and expands it in a way that not only justifies a sequel, but makes it so that we want more sequels. Just not that one. Never that one. Number 14, Evil Dead 2. I'm not a horror fan, but the Evil Dead series is a series of horror movies that I like, and as good as the first Evil Dead is, Evil Dead 2 is superior in every way. Straight horror is fine, but horror comedy is where the Raimi brothers shine. And while Army of Darkness is a fine movie, it's not quite as amazing as the first Evil Dead sequel. This is the film that gave us Ash's quips, the chainsaw hand, and everything that people remember about the Evil Dead series. It's everything that you want in a sequel, and it's even better considering that it's basically the movie that made Bruce Campbell into the well-known actor he is today. And just for that, the movie is awesome. Like a good sequel, it took the weird, gross horror elements of the first one, added in some comedy, and created the hybrid that really is where Sam Raimi shines. Plus, considering that the movie had some not-so-great people get killed instead of it being solely Ash's friends, I didn't feel as bad during some of the death scenes, which makes me enjoy it more because I'm not thinking about how bad that must feel for them. And without this, we wouldn't have Ash vs. the Evil Dead, and I don't know if I want to live in a world without that. Number 13, Skyfall. So while I like James Bond, I don't really have a favorite Bond. Connery, Moore, Lazenby, Rassilon, they're all 007 to me. But Skyfall made me seriously consider naming Craig as my favorite. Quantum of Solace was a disappointment, but this was gold. Between Adele's brilliant theme to this movie, to the story, to the adding to the lore of Bond, to giving Dame Judi Dench's M a great send-off, it's one of the best Bond movies I've ever seen. And I haven't seen all of them, but that's still pretty great praise. At the time that I saw the movie, I had never really seen a Bond film aside from catching bits and pieces on cable, but that movie made me love James Bond. And more importantly, inspired my first Christmas review, since I ended up deciding to read the first Bond novel that I could find at the library, which turned out to be On Her Majesty's Secret Service, so it's got that going for it too. Plus, it takes the usual trope of make cheeky references that usually just make you want to watch older material and made it compelling. You should have heard the theater that I was in when I saw Skyfall back in 2012, when they revealed that his partner, played by Naomi Harris, was Miss Moneypenny. People were so excited. And that's how those references should work, and I am so happy that Skyfall got it right. And that's really what makes it a great sequel. Number 12, ScoobyDoo 2 Monsters Unleashed. The first Scooby-Doo movie is a bit of a clusterfuck, with all the crazy stuff in the island and with Scrappy, but the sequel was definitely a return to the elements that made the cartoons popular. We got their entire rogues gallery, including some of my personal favorites, like the Black Knight. And we got a lot of character development and a pretty stellar performances from all involved. The first movie made me like the concept of live-action Scooby-Doo, but this one made me see the characters as the ones I'd watched in the cartoon my entire childhood. The first one was great, and it had some great stuff. I really did miss having Isla Fisher's Mary Jane in the sequel, but it was overall a true Scooby-Doo movie. Overall, while the first movie had some funny bits, the entire Magic and Monsters or Real arc, while interesting, isn't really Scooby-Doo. Plus, this one had the entire team working together for the entire movie, mostly, as opposed to them arbitrarily breaking up at the beginning only to reunite on Spooky Island. Overall, the first one was a good movie, but this one really felt like an episode of the show. Number 11, Spider-Man 2. Speaking of Raimi, the first Spider-Man is great, but it has some issues. The sequel, on the other hand, is amazing. It's like Raimi's thing. He makes a great first movie, good enough to warrant a sequel, and then knocks it out of the park with the sequel. First Evil Dead, and now Spider-Man. Green Goblin was an okay villain, but Alfred Molina as Otto Octavius is so much better. I think it's 'cause while Dafoe's acting lent itself well to Osborn's craziness, he's not really a sympathetic villain because he was still a crappy father to Harry, who we actually like. Whereas Molina gave us a really sympathetic Doc Ock. Plus, this movie has the entire subplot of Peter losing his powers due to his loss of confidence, which is way more compelling than the emo Pete dance from its successor. And what it did carry over from the first movie, namely keeping J.K. Simmons as J. Jonah Jameson, makes it everything the first movie was and more. It was way better than the third one as well, because it doesn't feature pointless retcons and more villains than it needs. It is probably one of the most perfect superhero sequels I've ever seen. Number 10, Spy Kids 2, The Island of Lost Dreams. Spy Kids 2 is a great movie, and it had a lot of good characters that made reappearances in this one, like Alan Cumming as Floop and Tony Shalhoub as Minion, not to mention the entire Cortez family, including Uncle Felix, who isn't really their uncle. And it introduces new characters like the Giggles, who are pretty good as antagonists, especially how the dad, one of the agents they saved from Floop in the last movie, is the bad guy. Plus, it has Steve Buscemi in one of his shockingly most sympathetic roles ever, as the scientist on the Island of Lost Dreams who created all the giant animal hybrids. And I would be remiss if I ignored the fact that this movie introduces Ricardo Montalban as Grandpa Cortez, which is one of his best roles in my opinion. But then again, any roles he plays is his best role because he's such a brilliant actor. This one has a more complicated story and a lot more special effects, and while the villain is a lot more standard for this one, instead of the fake-out from the first movie between Floop and Minion, it's still a wholly enjoyable movie and not just a rehash of the first one, which it very easily could have been. It was its own thing, and I think it did pretty well for that. Number 9, Austin Powers, The Spy Who Shagged Me. So last summer I was gonna do a How to Fix It on Austin Powers and Goldmember, because I thought it was the weakest of the Austin Powers trilogy. And it is, just not enough to warrant a review, at least right now. But I also realized that the second movie is the strongest from the trilogy, at least in my book. It's got everything that I like, time travel and a crap ton of slapstick, and it introduced the character whose voice would later become the most recognizable in children's movies, Fat Bastard, whose Scottish accent Myers would later reuse for Shrek. Sure, there are some things I don't like about this movie, like how they just toss away Vanessa by saying that she was replaced by a robot, so Austin could go back to being a swinging single guy, but it also introduced Mini-Me, so... And Heather Graham as Felicity is a suitable replacement for Vanessa. Different, but it works. Overall, this builds off the comedy of the first movie, while giving it a way to factor in more 60s-era shenanigans with the time travel plot. And every scene with Myers in it is absolute comedy gold, especially his banter with Seth Green as Dr. Evil. It's not quite as strong as the other two films had, but it's pretty strong. Number 8, Halloween Town 2, Calabar's Revenge. I'll keep this short since I already sort of touched on this a month ago, but yeah, this movie took all the cool stuff from the first movie and managed to make it even better. We even got a time travel plot that actually made logical sense and wasn't just an in-joke Easter egg fest. And that movie also sidelined Debbie Reynolds for most of the main story once she gets affected by the gray spell. But at least that's a logical thing to happen, and she wasn't just completely locked out of the story. She was still there, just unable to help Marnie. And the subplot with Dylan and Sophie taking out Cal and his pretend golem father is really well done. And the ending is the same sort of deal as Return to Halloween Town, with them all working together to defeat the bad guy, but this time it's actually them all working together and not just Marnie, Dylan, and Gwen. Plus, Marnie's romantic arc with Luke makes sense because her and Luke actually had a thing in the first movie. Plus, Cal is so much more of a villain than the entirety of the Dominion. I actually did find him to be formidable, while the Dominion was just laughable. Overall, this does what a sequel is supposed to do. Build off of the previous film and create something even better. Still fits. We'll be right back with more of the show. Hello and welcome. And we're back. Number 7, Superman 2. Kneel before Zod. Yeah, this one had to be on the list somewhere. It's only really here because I haven't actually watched it since I was a kid, so I have no idea if it holds up, though I'm pretty sure it does. I'm also pretty sure it has the stupid cellophane S-throwing scenes, though your mileage may vary. But it's the Superman film that I remember the most from when I was a kid. I stayed up late one night to watch this and the first one, but while most people remember the "if you've got me, who's got you" scene from the first one, my most memorable Superman scene is the entire Niagara Falls sequence. It's been burned into my memory, and it's the first thing that comes to mind when I think of Christopher Reeve's Superman. Side note, if they ever do a Christopher Reeve biopic and don't cast Brandon Routh as Reeve, that is a crying shame, because he was able to perfectly nail Reeve's acting mannerisms in Superman Returns, and his turn as Ray Palmer on Legends of Tomorrow has just reinforced my opinion of that, and where was I? Oh, right. And we also have a brilliant villain in General Zod. Not the garbage Zod from Man of Steel, but the true General Zod. Terrence Stamp is brilliant as Zod, and he's probably the greatest supervillain that we've ever seen on the silver screen to date in a Superman movie. Sure, it's got some bad stuff, like Superman wiping Lois's memory of his identity, but then we've got some good stuff, like the team-up of Luthor and Zod, which is done way better than Batman v Superman ever could have done it. Number 6, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Raiders of the Lost Ark is a classic for sure, but there's nothing better than the banter that Connery and Ford have in this movie. One of my favorite scenes in all of cinema is the ending scene where Henry and Indy discuss his name, and naturally, having an appearance by John Rhys-Davies is no small part in my enjoyment of it. Sure, the movie changed stuff, like dumbing down Marcus Brody when he was competent in Raiders, but that is a small concession to make for the brilliance of this movie, not only in story, but in characters. Julian Glover is a great villain who chose poorly. And the stuff with Ilsa is good too. It's probably my favorite Indiana Jones movie because it's got all the stuff from the first two and puts it all together to make something really great. Plus, it's got a lot of Indian code defeating Nazis, which is always a delight. And the bit we get at the beginning showing young Indiana Jones is awesome too, because it shows that Indy's always been a badass. Overall, it takes everything that made Raiders great, but adds in great stuff like Sean Connery and Julian Glover to make this the best entry in the Indiana Jones series to date. Number 5, Clerks 2. Clerks is a great movie. In fact, it's pretty much the definition of what an indie film is. Just Google indie movie and see what pops up first. And the sequel is pretty damn awesome. The first movie was a character piece on Dante, and so is this one, but it expands it a lot more and gives us what we really wanted out of the first one. Dante got a happy ending. The first one ended abruptly, but in this one, Dante has his shit together. Him and Randall are friends again, and the quick stop is back. And I do applaud the changing of venue, because a fast food place gets a lot more weirdos nowadays than a convenience store. At least in my experience. Clerks is a great movie with great comedy, but some of the funniest exchanges that Kevin Smith has ever written came from this one. There's that scene with Wanda Sykes, which I won't quote because it's wildly offensive, but it's self-aware and used it to show Randall's idiocy, and we get the line that is probably my favorite from any Kevin Smith movie.
Alright, look. There's only one return, okay? And it ain't of the king, it's of the Jedi.
What can I say? I love books, but I'm not really a Tolkien fan apart from The Hobbit. But overall, Clerks 2 takes everything I loved about the original, gives it some color, and turns it into one of the best films in Kevin Smith's filmography. Still waiting on Clerks 3, Silent Bob. Number 4, Back to the Future 2. Admittedly, it's half 2015, a quarter alternative timeline, and a quarter reusing assets from the first movie, so it's a bit of a rehash, but it's still a damn good movie. While some people enjoy the third movie more because it has more original material, I love the second movie more. Is it because I like the future and alternate timelines? Perhaps, but it is pretty awesome because we basically get 3 villains for the price of 1. Griff, alternate Biff, and young Biff. And Tom Wilson puts in a great performance considering that he was playing like quintuple duty, considering that he had to be present Biff, old Biff, Griff, young Biff, and alternate Biff. Not to mention the returning cast, Michael J. Fox, Leah Thompson, Christopher Lloyd, all do brilliantly. Yeah, it changed stuff, like adding in the Marty's propensity for violence when called a chicken, and lost Crispin Glover and Claudia Wells, but Elizabeth Shue is a great replacement as Jennifer. The overall story, which was admittedly more noble than the first movies, which was Save My Existence due to my own problems, with this movie being Save History from being destroyed by Biff, was great. And I just love the visuals of 2015, because it really is 2015 by way of the 1980s. Still waiting for Jaws 19, by the way. Though I wonder how they'd keep it going. I guess it's Brody's great-grandson fighting the shark's grandkid, right? Overall, Galen Zemeckis did a great job continuing the story of the first movie in this, and while Back to the Future 3 is a decent movie, this is what I'll always think of as the best Back to the Future sequel. Number 3, Toy Story 2. Toy Story was one of the movies I owned on VHS as a kid and watched it over and over and over and over and over. I loved that movie. I had a Woody doll with the pull string until my brother cut the string to take the vest off. Anyway, Toy Story 2 is even better, because while the first one was dealing with replacement, the second film was much more action-packed because the antagonistic force, apart from Al and Stinky Pete, was being forgotten. Toys are forgotten sometimes and then become collector's items, and seeing Woody realize that he's more than just a toy to be forgotten, that he has this mythos behind him, that he was at one point just as popular as Buzz Lightyear later was, but still wants to go back to being Andy's toy, is the greatest arc that we could ever get. Even Toy Story 3, which is a masterpiece, can't quite top this one as my favorite. I still own this one on VHS if you want to measure for how much I love it. Lost track of the first one, but this one I kept safe. Add in the arc from Jessie, which is, again, not wanting to be forgotten, and the fact that her entire arc led credence to the idea that Andy's mom was her original owner, makes this one of the best and most emotionally charged kids' movies I've ever seen. And the voice acting is superb, too. We've got Tom Hanks, Tim Allen, and all the returning cast, and even the new cast members are fantastic as well. Throw in the fact that the technology for animation got way better by this point, so the humans don't look quite as Uncanny Valley, and the awesome Star Wars arc that Belt Buzz has with Emperor Zurg, it makes for a great sequel to one of my favorite movies ever. Speaking of Star Wars, number 2, The Empire Strikes Back. Full disclosure, Return of the Jedi is my favorite Star Wars movie, but as a sequel, Empire Strikes Back is nearly the greatest sequel ever. The stuff on Hoth with the AT-ATs, Yoda, Boba Fett, Lando, this is the movie that gave us so many Star Wars staples, and while there's always a place in my heart for the original, nothing can really top this as a sequel. Honestly, part of me hopes that Last Jedi cribs some of the stuff from this because of how awesome a movie it is. The lightsaber fights got upgraded from that rather silly bit with Obi-Wan and Vader in the first movie, and we get to see more of the Falcon in action. Luke actually uses his lightsaber apart from training, and we get our first glimpses at what Jedi training is like. Carrie Fisher puts in a great performance as Leia, as do Harrison Ford and Mark Hamill, and Billy D. Williams is fantastic as Lando, especially when he's dealing with Vader. And who could forget the most immortal line in the entire franchise? "No, I am your father." Everything from the first movie is present here. Well, except for Tarkin and the rebels who died during the trench run, and Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru. But we also get a lot more expanded upon, like Han and Leia's romantic arc, which culminates in, "I love you. I know," right before the carbonite scene. And who could forget the most awkward family dinner in all of cinema? Empire is a great movie on its own, and one of the greatest sequels out there, because it took everything we loved about the first movie and made it even better. Number 1, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. This is the perfect sequel, and it's sort of a double sequel, both a sequel to the first Star Trek movie, and it actually manages to build off of that plot to make this a great movie, but it's also a sequel to one of the best episodes of the show. It's pretty much my favorite movie of all time. I mean, it's got a great story, great character bits, and it's such a great sequel that J.J. Abrams and the Kelvin Timeline team decided that the best way to continue their new Star Trek saga was to copy it shot for shot. That didn't work, obviously, but it says something when their method of making a sequel is to copy a previous, and arguably the best of the original Trek sequels. Kirk's entire arc in this movie is just about the greatest character arc ever, and it even manages to build off of Kirk's arc in the first movie where he couldn't give up the chair, and managed to realize the lesson that he would later impart to Picard in Generations. It's really down to the production team. Harv Bennett, Nick Meyer, they really understood Star Trek and what Star Trek was, and managed to impart that into the film. Khan's revenge arc is brilliant as well, and that's what's so great, is that Montalban manages to really give the performance the movie needed, being a true Captain Ahab, being reserved when he needs to be, and manic when he's about to catch his white whale. Plus, there's even great comedy, especially between the triumvirate of Kirk, Spock, and McCoy. And Saavik is is very well done as well, and I wish Kirstie Alley had reprised her role because I think something was lost when she was recast. And Spock's death, the fact that they took a beloved character and killed him and made it a decent death, that if he didn't come back, I wouldn't have been mad because that was one of the best death scenes ever. It packed more of a punch than the ending of Decker and Ilea's arc. Overall, I could never sing this movie's praises enough, and it is my favorite movie of all time, in addition to being my favorite sequel of all time as well. And those were my top 15 favorite sequels. Did any of yours make the list? Did I omit any? I probably did. Those were just my favorites out of all the sequels out there, and I did have to omit certain ones due to plans for the future. Though all this talk about sequels is giving me a really great idea. Anyway, that's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more of the Literary Larry, you can hit that subscribe button, and if you have any comments or complaints, you can put those in the comments section below. Oh, and if you want to be notified of new uploads, you can hit that bell icon. And if you enjoyed this video, show it to your friends and share it around the internet. And maybe consider supporting the show on Patreon. Next week is a Patreon-sponsored review of Season 2 of The Flash. But come back the week after for... I'll tell you then. See you next time. Where was I? Oh, right. And we also have a brilliant villain in General Zod. Not the garbage Zod from Man of Steel, but the true General Zod. Terrence Stamp is brilliant as Zod, and he's probably the I'm recording this in the Batman v Superman in the same day, so I can't really talk because I had to do my big freak out.